Imagine you are sitting inside a metal sphere roughly the size of a walk-in closet, descending through water so deep and so dark that the surface exists, for you only as a memory. It is February 17, 1977. The pressure outside the hull of the research submersible Alvin is approximately 250 atmospheres, 250 times what you feel standing on a sidewalk at sea level. The ambient temperature of the water surrounding you is 2 degrees Celsius. The seafloor you are approaching, a volcanic spreading zone called the Galapagos Rift, sits 2,500 meters below the surface of the eastern Pacific. Every scientific model available to the crew that day made the same prediction about what they were going to find: essentially nothing. No sunlight meant no photosynthesis. No photosynthesis meant no food chain. No food chain meant no life, at least not in any density worth documenting. That expectation, and the reason it was so completely wrong, is exactly what this video is about: how an ecosystem that should not exist by the standards of 1977 turned out to have been running continuously for millions of years. What Alvin found that day was not a barren seafloor, and explaining why requires going all the way down to the chemistry of sulfur. To understand what made that February dive so disorienting for the scientists involved, you first need to understand what they had been taught and what all of ecology had correctly assumed for more than a century. Every ecosystem studied in any depth, from equatorial rainforests to polar tundra to the sediment surface of the abyssal plain, traced its energy back to the same source, the sun. Photosynthesis, the process by which plants, algae, and certain bacteria convert light energy into organic matter, was not simply one strategy among many. It was understood to be the universal foundation. Every food web, without exception, had light at its base. How did the deep ocean fit into this picture? It fit, but only as a receiver. Life did exist below the sunlight zone, and biologists had cataloged it for decades. But that life depended on what oceanographers called marine snow, the slow, continuous drift of organic particles from the surface downward. Dead phytoplankton, zooplankton fecal pellets, fragments of larger organisms, all of it falling at roughly 100 meters per day, delivering diluted parcels of surface energy to the depths. The deeper you went, the less marine snow arrived, and the sparser life became. At 2,500 meters, that trickle should have been barely sufficient to support scattered scavengers. It could not, by any calculation available at the time, support what the Alvin crew was looking at through their viewports. Tube worms nearly 2 meters in length, clams the diameter of dinner plates, dense mats of mussels, pale crabs picking their way through all of it. And rising from fractures in the basaltic seafloor columns of shimmering superheated water, hydrothermal vents releasing fluid at temperatures no conventional biology said should be compatible with the life surrounding them. The marine snow hypothesis could not account for this density. What was feeding the base of this community? What was generating the organic carbon? The answer had been sitting in chemistry textbooks for decades, in a process that, until that moment, no one had thought to scale up to an ecosystem. That process is chemosynthesis, specifically the oxidation of hydrogen sulfide, H2S, by bacteria. Here is the clearest way to think about it. In photosynthesis, a plant drives a chemical reaction using light. It takes carbon dioxide and water, assembles them into sugar, and releases oxygen. The critical energy input is the photon. In chemosynthesis, certain bacteria perform a structurally analogous operation, but the energy input is not light. It is the energy released when hydrogen sulfide is oxidized, when electrons are stripped from the sulfur atom. The bacteria use that released energy to fix carbon dioxide into organic molecules, carbon-based compounds that other organisms can consume and build tissue from. The input differs completely. The output is the same fixed carbon available to the food chain above. Is this reaction rare or exotic? Not chemically. Sulfur oxidizing bacteria had been cultured in laboratories for decades before 1977. What no one had anticipated was that they could exist in concentrations large enough to form the visible base of a complex animal community, and that hydrothermal vents supplied both the H2's fuel and the dissolved oxygen needed to run the reaction continuously at scale. The formal name for what these bacteria do, build organic matter from inorganic chemicals using energy from chemical reactions, is chemolithotrophy. Before February 1977, it was a biochemical footnote. Afterward, it was an ecological foundation. But chemosynthesis alone does not explain how the energy gets from a bacterial mat on the seafloor into a 2-meter tube worm. That transfer requires a partnership unlike anything biologists had documented in a complex animal. Dissect an adult Riftia pachyptila, and you find no mouth, no stomach, no intestines. The worm's digestive system, in any conventional sense, does not exist. What fills roughly 15% of its interior, 15% exact percentage, verify with Childress and Fisher 1992, or equivalent physiological study, is an organ called the trophosome, a dense, lobulated, darkly pigmented structure threaded throughout with blood vessels. Under a microscope, the trophosome is packed, almost in its entirety, with bacteria, chemosynthetic bacteria living inside the worm's own tissue. This arrangement is endosymbiosis, one organism living inside the cells or tissues of another, to the benefit of both. The concept was not new in 1977. Biologists already understood that the mitochondria inside your own cells, the structures that produce the energy keeping you alive right now, are the evolutionary descendants of bacteria that, roughly 1.5 to 2 billion years ago, were engulfed by a host cell and retained rather than digested. Riftia and its bacterial tenants follow the same foundational logic. The worm provides the bacteria with a sheltered, stable environment and a supply of raw materials. The bacteria provide the worm with organic carbon effectively, food. Research by biologist Colleen Cavanaugh, published in 1981, provided the first clear evidence that Riftia's internal bacteria were genuinely performing chemosynthesis, ruling out the possibility that the worm was somehow surviving on marine snow drifting down from 2,500 meters above. Moderate cum confirmed Cavanaugh et al. 1981. Science volume, page numbers, exact title. Riftia is, in biological terms, a farmer growing its food supply inside its own body, under controlled conditions without a digestive tract of any kind. This is a form of internal agriculture that evolved hundreds of millions of years before anything on land attempted anything comparable. But a farmer still needs to supply the farm, and supplying this particular farm turns out to require solving one of the most elegant engineering problems in the invertebrate world. What is that problem? Exactly. The bacteria inside the trophosome need two things to perform chemosynthesis: hydrogen sulfide and oxygen, both delivered continuously in usable quantities. The problem is that hydrogen sulfide and oxygen react with each other. Most organisms that encounter H2s in significant concentrations die from it. The mechanism is essentially identical to cyanide poisoning. It blocks the enzyme that allows cells to use the oxygen in their blood. If Riftia simply absorbed H2s through its body wall and allowed it to circulate freely alongside oxygen in the bloodstream, the two compounds would react before reaching the trophosome. The available oxygen would be depleted, the bacteria would starve, the worm would follow. What Riftia evolved instead is a hemoglobin unlike anything found in vertebrate animals. Its blood contains multiple types of hemoglobin molecules. Some bind oxygen, operating on the same basic principle as human blood. Others bind hydrogen sulfide, specifically sequestering it in the bloodstream, preventing it from reacting with the oxygen traveling alongside it, and releasing it in a controlled manner only when the blood reaches the lobules of the trophosome. Moderate Cunningham's molecular identification of H2's binding hemoglobin in Riftia cites specific study, likely from Childress Lab or Zal et al. Think of it as a divided chemical highway, where the two lanes carry reactive cargo that must be kept physically separated until the exact point of delivery. Two compounds that would destroy each other on contact, transported simultaneously through the same circulatory system, arriving at the same destination without having touched. When researchers characterized the sulfide binding properties of Riftia hemoglobin in the late 1980s, the description that appeared in the literature was notable by the measured standards of scientific writing, not because the chemistry was unprecedented in principle, but because a living animal had evolved it independently in isolation, under conditions no biologist had thought to examine. The trophosome on the surface appears to be a bacterial housing structure. What it actually is, once you trace its supply chain, is the terminus of a precision chemical delivery system that has no close parallel in the animal kingdom. Now consider what all of this looks like when every component runs simultaneously. A fracture opens in the basaltic seafloor along a mid-ocean ridge. Water that has percolated down through cracks in the crust, heated to 300 to 400 degrees Celsius by proximity to underlying magma chambers, picks up hydrogen sulfide, heavy metals, and dissolved minerals and is expelled back into the ocean. At this depth, roughly 250 atmospheres of pressure prevents the superheated liquid from boiling. It exits as dense, shimmering fluid and meets the surrounding seawater sitting at 2 degrees Celsius. The mixing zone where hot, sulfide-rich vent fluid dilutes into cold, oxygenated deep water spans just a few meters around each opening. Chemosynthetic bacteria are the first colonizers. They establish on rock surfaces and sediment wherever the mixing gradient provides both H2S and oxygen in usable ratios. As they multiply, they produce fixed carbon small grazers arrive amphipods, limpet scraping bacterial films from rock surfaces. Then larger filter feeders, clams and mussels drawing bacteria from the water column. Then Riftia, oriented precisely within the chemical boundary, its feathery red plume extended toward the warmer sulfide-rich current, its tube anchored in the cooler, more oxygenated flow so that its circulatory system draws from both sides of the gradient simultaneously. The sulfide-binding hemoglobin picks up H2s near the plume. The oxygen-binding hemoglobin loads up on the cold water side. Both compounds travel inward through the same blood, kept apart by molecular structure, and meet for the first time inside the trophosome, where the bacteria are waiting. Around a single active vent, this cascade can sustain tubeworm colonies that are decades old, clam beds covering many square meters, and crab populations numbering in the thousands. Not a single joule of energy in that community traces back to sunlight. The sun is 2,500 meters above, and energetically does not participate. The 1977 Alvin expedition did not discover a curiosity at the margins of biology. It revealed that the foundational assumption underlying a century of ecological science that photosynthesis is the only viable entry point for energy into any food web of meaningful complexity was a generalization that described the world scientists had already looked at, not the world as it actually is. The ecosystem that shouldn't exist, as it turned out, had been running continuously, unobserved, on chemical energy derived from the Earth's own geological activity for potentially millions of years before anyone thought to descend and look. Since 1977, more than 700 hydrothermal vent fields have been identified across the world's ocean floors, according to WikiTele's current CountCheck Interridge database, as figure changes with each new survey. The sulfide-binding hemoglobin unique to Riftia is now studied for potential applications in medical oxygen delivery systems. The bacteria themselves are of active interest for industrial sulfur processing applications. And the principle, the Galapagos rift, demonstrated that chemosynthesis can sustain a complex ecosystem without any connection to sunlight, has directly reshaped astrobiology. If an icy moon like Europa or Enceladus contains liquid water warmed by tidal forces, and if that water is in contact with mineral-rich rock, then chemical gradients capable of supporting chemosynthesis may exist there. The question of whether life requires light, once settled, is now genuinely open. The hydrothermal vent community is why. We started with a metal sphere descending through 2,500 meters of water toward a seafloor that every available model predicted would be nearly lifeless. What Alvin found was a community running on sulfur chemistry, symbiotic partnerships, and a divided chemical transport system in the blood of an animal without a stomach. None of those solutions were designed. Each one persisted because organisms that lacked it did not survive at depth long enough to pass on their traits. What remains the tube worm, the trophosome, the two-lane hemoglobin, is what 150 million years of selection in darkness looks like. That leaves one question I genuinely want your answer to. Of everything covered here, the fact that Riftia evolved to transport two mutually reactive chemicals through the same bloodstream without allowing them to touch, the fact that it has no gut at all, or the fact that the 1977 science crew reportedly needed several minutes of silent observation before anyone agreed on what to report back to the surface ship, which detail shifted something in how you think about what life actually requires. Leave that in the comments below.